Masande Nchanga recently released his second novel. It's called Triangulum. Nadine Munsami is also here. She's a literature lecturer from the University of Pretoria, and also joining the conversation is ENC journalist Andrea van Wyk. Good morning, guys. Good to have you in studio.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Triangulum, Masande, your novel. I know, Andrea, you've read this novel?
Yes, absolutely.
What were your thoughts about it?
Well, I'm a big fan of the dystopian setting. In other words, the subgenre of science fiction where you imagine a world that is quite possible. It hasn't happened yet, but it is a possible world. And in Masande's novel, part of it is set 50 years into the future, and imagining some of the scientific developments that might have happened, that sort of thing. And his main character, who we don't really get her name, she's part of this and spearheading some of this research. That's very fascinating.
Okay, Masande, how did you come up with Triangulum?
Basically, I think what I wanted to do was imagine where we might end up in 50 years as a country. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me, at least from my experience, you know, of being a South African and my experience of history, is that it would obviously have something to do with where we've been, right? And so it began by a process of research that involved kind of reading up and exploring what happened towards the end of the Homeland System in the early 90s and what kind of reverberations, you know, that might have in terms of a future society.
Yeah. All right. Nadine, you are researching post-colonial science fiction by African authors. Why?
Well, I think there's an interesting moment where we find that on the one hand, like African authors are now using science fiction as a genre to actually look back, well, as Masande was saying, look back at our past. And more so in relation to like indigenous African knowledge systems that have been denigrated by movements like colonialism and apartheid. And then actually starting to unearth and then utilize this as a form of science in their novels. And a science that goes on to build very progressive African futures sometimes. So there's that aspect, and I think also because we often tend to look at science fiction as popular genre fiction, and tend to dismiss it as popular and maybe not very useful in that sense. But science fiction is very political in its nature and underpinning, and so can help us very usefully think through these trajectories.
That's a very good point, because when you look at, Andrew, when you look at a movie like Avatar, that's basically a story about colonization, isn't it?
Absolutely. And a lot of science fiction and dystopian fiction deals with that. It's about what if. What if something happened? Yeah, absolutely, as you're saying, like novels like Avatar deal with that, and sorry, not novels, movies like Avatar deal with that, so it really spills over into film as well.
Masande, do you find that we're becoming a bit more adventurous or in African literature, and not just always talking about, you know, our past and so forth, just making up new worlds?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I would go further and say it's almost a global trend, actually. With black writers in general, I think a lot of us are kind of curious about exploring other forms in order to kind of speak to what the experience of being marginalized.
Is it easier for you? Because, let me ask your age.
33.
You're 33, so you're basically growing up in this world where you're not really experiencing, you know, colonization in the way that maybe the older generation have. Is it easier for you just to come up with your own new world than maybe it is for a guy like myself? No, it's a fact. It's
interesting because I actually don't feel like I experienced that I was kind of born outside of you know, apartheid. I think I was born in 1986, you know, which was kind of famously a year in which a state of emergency was declared. So for me, kind of making sense of myself and where I fit into the society necessarily does involve that history. But I suppose also just kind of almost being a digital native. I am probably a lot more at home with technology and kind of extrapolating where it might end up and things like that.
Nadine, you say of interest is how African writers adapt the genre to suit the continent itself, almost Wakanda style sort of thing going on here.
Yeah, to some extent. I think there's some rigorous work happening around how authors are actually taking these science fiction narratives and tropes and then translating it into some kind of indigenous lexicon, which is really fascinating. Yeah.
I suppose we can't do anything else. This is it is where we're from. Andrea, any other books out there that maybe when we look at African fiction, it might be interesting?
Well, one of the biggest authors to come out of Africa in terms of this genre would have to be Neri Okorafor, who's a Nigerian-American writer. Some of her books have won multiple awards, for example, and she also imagines Africa in a dystopian setting. She brings in folklore, things like like witchcraft and that sort of thing, but it's all also very much related to this post-colonial genre or setting, so that and she, for example, writes about societies in which people are sorry, I'm losing my words over here. Yeah. Yeah. Societies in which people are rejected, and it's very much about identity. So the genre also really, really explores identity and how we can adapt to various situations.
Okay. I mentioned Avatar. That was a movie, but you can also look at how we are progressing in Africa when you look at a film like District 9, for example. And, that's an African story, but that's a sci-fi story, and it worked really, really well. It was accepted by audiences around the world because that movie did well. That's a fantastic example to use, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's really something interesting there, right? Because you point at District 9, and that had such a fraught reception on the continent and then globally, where people globally found it very interesting and fascinating, and then there were so many contentious issues on the continent, and South Africans also feeling that it was very dystopian in its through line.
But that was the point, isn't it? It was that I know the some of the contentious issues where I think it was the part where the Nigerian guys, they were portrayed in a bad way. But how many movies have you seen where the Russians are portrayed in a bad way? And now, unfortunately, it's now the terrorists who are now everybody's enemy. So that's always going to happen. Are we too sensitive about things like that on the continent?
I would say yes and no, because on the one hand, yes, we are now participating in popular genre fiction, right? Pop culture. So as you said, this is a formulaic story and there's always going to be a baddie. And so why not the Nigerians? But then if we think about this from a socio-political perspective, there is something highly problematic there, because we do have these historical relations with our fellow African brothers and sisters, and it has created problems in South Africa in particular, so it warrants looking at.
Okay, Masande, who is your protagonist in your novel Triangulum? Were you careful about how you portrayed other Africans?
Of course, you always kind of have to work to make the character plausible, and so things like being sensitive are naturally going to be fitted into that. So my narrator is actually a female character that we meet from girlhood and follow until, middle age and beyond. And yeah, I mean, I think the portrayals are pretty fair.
They're pretty fair.
Yeah.
All right, guys, thank you for coming through, Andrea van Wyk, as always. And then Masande Nchanga, that's your book there. It's called Triangle. That's your second novel as well?
Yeah.
Okay, well done. Nadine Munsami, thank you for coming through as well. And we hope we see more books, sci-fi books and just general fantasy coming through from African authors. I would love that.